Okay, so today we're here to discuss discrimination and how it's a part of human nature. So first of all, we're going to go over what the building blocks are of discrimination. How do we get to that point? So we have stereotypes. What are stereotypes? They are a set of generalized beliefs and expectations about a specific group or its members. It's an oversimplification of the world, and it can be negative or positive. And it is generally a result of the tendency to categorize and organize the vast amount of information we have and we encounter in our everyday lives. So, what is prejudice? Stereotypes can lead to prejudice. And to define it, it can be negative or positive, and it is an evaluation of a group and its members. So an example would be racial prejudice, for example, and at that point you evaluate a person according to their racial characteristics rather than their abilities. So we have positive prejudice, such as, I love the Irish, and you can also have negative prejudice, which is, I hate immigrants. Social psychologists tend to focus on the study of the negative prejudice to understand its roots and causes. So then we get to discrimination. Discrimination is when you act on a negative prejudice. Acting on a negative prejudice is discrimination. So defining it, it is a behavior directed against an individual or members of a specific group. So we have foundations to prejudice. No one is actually born disliking a racial group, an ethnic group, a gender. So psychologists have several theories to explain where it comes from. The first one is observational learning. So you dislike a certain group based on the observation of how your parents treat that group, or the media, for example. The media tends to portray certain stereotypes. For example, Italians, mafia; Jews, greedy bankers; African Americans, lazy and promiscuous. Children actually as young as 6 months can judge according to differences in skin color, and as early as 3 years can develop preferences for their specific group. So this leads us to the second theory, which is social identity. Individuals view the world from an ethnocentric perspective, so they judge others depending on from the group they're in. Being in a group builds self-esteem, pride, image of self-worth, and the negative aspect of maximizing social respect and self-esteem, you start seeing the group you're in as the higher one. You maximize the positive aspects of your group, and you, I guess, devalue the aspects of the other group. Finally, we have social neuroscience. And this points to the limitation of the human cognitive ability. There is so much information we have to process, and our brain's ability to categorize them is so limited, so we categorize all the information we get. So we categorize according to race, gender, and ethnic groups, and eventually when we familiarize ourselves with specific groups, then we start building little subgroups for them. So these little categorizations can actually lead to stereotypes, and ultimately, if you act on it or negatively, then it leads to discrimination. So, we often experience uncomfortable expressions of discrimination in our everyday lives. How do we deal with them? Erin is going to go ahead and give us a scenario and explain how to deal with that.
Okay, so what we're going to do now is actually introduce a scenario that y'all as the audience are going to act out. So here in a minute we're going to have y'all get into pairs, and the scenario is one of you is going to play the role of a waitress at a coffee shop or a diner, and you go up to your friend or your coworker and you say, you know, I really hate old people. You spend 15 minutes talking to them and all you get is a 5% tip. So while you're talking about this, while you're going over this scenario, I want you to think about a few things. First of all, is this discriminatory? Is this actually a discriminatory statement? If it is, what is an effective versus an ineffective response to this statement? What would your response be? Try to think about if your response would be immediate or if it would be delayed. If your response would be public or if it would be in private. Or try to think about if you would respond at all. So we're going to give you guys about 1 to 2 minutes to break into pairs right now and go over this exercise, and then we're going to call on a couple volunteers to talk about their responses. Okay? Time. What's your watch say?
15.
Okay. Yeah. Good job. Everybody can just finish up their sentences. So we're going to take 2 volunteers, if we can get 2 groups to talk about what their responses were, and try to keep in mind the questions I asked you. Would your response be immediate or delayed? Would your response be in private or public? Would you choose not to respond at all? If we can get a couple people, Josh and Dr. Kosapur have the mics, so just raise your hands.
If I know your name, you're in trouble. I'm going to come to you.
All right, here we go.
Our teammate over here had just a great story about a person who's a restaurant owner in Texas, small town, older group of women sitting in the restaurant doing the talk thing. And the one woman said, she goes, you know, I don't understand why they have Diet Coke here. And so the owner went down to the convenience store, came back, had it, gave her one, and said, listen, every time you come in, we're going to have this in the refrigerator. I just love the story because it just says no preconceived idea of this group. He saw it as a business opportunity and just, boom, went with it. So anyway, we went off on a little tangent.
Anyone else?
Anyone with effective or ineffective responses to a comment that seems
I
discriminatory?
found one.
I am a server, and I actually have a coworker that does this all the time. And I usually respond by saying, you know, culturally, some people are not taught that tipping 20% is the norm. And my pair over here said that maybe they don't have the money. And I say that all the time, you know, well, maybe they don't have enough money to tip you 20%. And she says, well, then they shouldn't be going out to eat at all. And talking about the having a 15-minute conversation with somebody and only getting a 5% tip, I've trained myself to value that conversation more, and I find that I will remember what I speak about with my tables rather than how much they tip me, because that is more valuable than the money that they give.
All right. Very good. So I want to talk a little bit about the responses. I mentioned that the responses can be immediate or delayed, and kind of talk about why that's the case. Sometimes, you know, your response is going to be immediate because you know what you're going to say, because you've encountered this before and you know exactly what you're going to say. Sometimes it's delayed because you have to think about what your response is going to be, and sometimes you have to think about if you're going to respond at all. Some people choose to respond to these kind of statements in public. You know, they'll either do it if they're on an agenda, if they want to try to make an example out of someone, or if they feel like they're going to gain, you know, force by numbers. You know, if other people around them are going to back them up. And sometimes, you know, they'll respond in private. They'll pull the person aside and respond in private if they're worried about humiliating the person, if they're worried about making a scene or a spectacle. And then the big question is, do you or do you not respond to a statement like this? And there was a study done. It was actually one of the first studies done on this subject, backed by the Commission on Community Relations with the American Jewish Congress. This is shortly after World War II. And they did kind of the same thing. They acted out vignettes of discriminatory comments to an audience. And the general response was 80% of the audience said they would be comfortable with any kind of response over none at all. So the general response was anything but silence. But oftentimes for a lot of us, the response is silence to this. But when we do respond, let's think about what makes an effective versus an ineffective response. So I think the key thing to think about is questions, not statements. Statements can often be dismissed. They can often be argued against. They can be seen as inaccurate. If your statement is just something that says, no, that's not true, they tip very well. Well, someone can easily argue that. Someone that can easily start an argument. Statements generate targets. They generate resistance, whereas questions open up dialogue and force an answer. So with questions, you're going to engage the other party in a dialogue. You're going to get talking about it. You're going to get down to the root of the cause. Good questions are, like, why would you say that? Or, do you feel that way about everyone? If you are going to make statements, you always want to avoid any type of inflammatory or insulting statements. Something like, oh, well, that's the most ignorant thing I've ever heard in my life. If you do that, you're gonna alienate the other party. You're gonna close them off, and they're not gonna want to talk to you. So they're not gonna want to approach the subject, and they may never talk to you again, depending on how inflammatory your comment is. The other thing to think about is talk about how you feel versus how they should be. So how you feel is undisputable. No one can tell you how you feel. No one can argue with that. But how they act, telling them how they act, that is disputable. So use statements like, I'm uncomfortable with that, or I don't feel like that was appropriate. Try to avoid stuff like, well, you shouldn't say that, or you shouldn't do that. Because again, it's going to open up an argument, it's going to shut them off. No one can tell you how you feel. So always go with your feelings. Approach the other party with respect. Don't approach them with self-righteous indignation. It's important to understand that we're all on the same team here. And oftentimes, if you think about it, people in this day and age will use discriminatory statements like that, not to be discriminatory, but out of humor, because they have found through media, through peers, through their environment, that it's funny. Sometimes statements like that can be viewed as humorous, and they don't see it as discriminatory. So, like I said, it's important to understand that we're all on the same page. We just want to get to the bottom and understand why you would say that. Try to cater to their self-image. You can say something like, well, gee, I'm really surprised that you would say that. I really thought that you were an open-minded person. That's going to make them start thinking, well, yeah, I am an open-minded person. Why would I say that? And then finally, like this lady mentioned, I don't mean to single you out, but you can sometimes say that it's good to defend the group and not the individual. Defending the individual in statements like this can sometimes reinforce the original statement, and it can not really get the point across, and it cannot really generate any change or any dialogue. So how can we diminish the effects of discrimination? There's a few good ways we can do this. The first would be to increase contact between the target of discrimination or the target of stereotyping and the holder of discrimination or stereotyping. So get people together. It's 2012. We don't need to be living separate worlds anymore. Make values and norms against prejudice more visible by reminding people about equality and fair treatment of others. Another good one is teaching people to be more aware of the positive characteristics of targets of stereotypes. And then finally, reducing stereotype threat or vulnerability so the members of the group don't satisfy the self-fulfilling prophecy. Thank you very much.